Joining us now, the Liberal campaign spokesman, Simon Birmingham. Onto the cancer plan, why hasn't the government moved to match Labor on that? Because it's clearly a very popular initiative.
Well, Kieran, we don't go around matching Labor's big spending promises because we know that if you just follow all of those big spending promises, you end up with the same problems as Labor, that there's not enough money, that you end up just having to hike up taxes or run up debt. You've got to be careful with the money you apply. And that, in the end, was a key message the Prime Minister delivered last night, whether it's in relation to childcare support, whether it's in relation to health support. You're careful with taxpayers' money to drive it to get the best value outcome. So in healthcare, it's the listing of 2,000 plus life-saving, life-altering and improving medicines that we've managed to deploy. It's investment in targeted support in cancer services. It's ensuring that we maintain record levels of bulk billing services. We've done all of those things, but we're not going to run around on a ill-defined cash splash like Mr Shorten has, and we won't be going and matching his reckless spending.
It is clear that the government is concerned about the cost of these policies, and there was a question put to Bill Shorten last night, and he said it was a dishonest question to ask about the cost of climate change. In that vein, what is the cost? What has the government spent in reaching that target, that 2030 target of a reduction in emissions by 26 to 28%?
Laura, I can tell you that the cost of delivering our climate solutions package to meet our 2030 targets is $3.5 billion. I can certainly go back and look over the previous budget papers to add up what the cost of making sure we meet and exceed our 2020 targets is. But that is the key point. We've acted, and we are on track to meet and exceed the 2020 Kyoto targets, despite all of the rhetoric from Bill Shorten, despite the fact that when he is asked perfectly reasonable questions, he denigrates the question either as dumb or dishonest, rather than acknowledging that you do have to recognise there are costs of action. Now, the cost of our climate solutions plan, $3.5 billion, that is a plan where we've outlined each of the steps along the way to meet our Paris 2030 target. Bill Shorten has failed to do that. He won't identify how he will actually get to the 45% target, which components of his policies will contribute to that, how much will rely upon purchase of overseas permits, and how much Australian businesses will have to spend overseas to buy those.
Do you accept, though, that in terms of modelling that component, that its relevance depends really on how much the cost of climate change is on the economy, the impact on the physical climate and so on in our world?
Well, we accept that there is a cost of inaction. That's why we have been acting. And this is a global problem in terms of addressing emissions levels.
But when you have modelling of one side of the equation, do you accept that you need both sides of the equation to actually have a credible understanding of what the cost is?
Well, Kieran, you've got to acknowledge that, yes, there is, as we do, there's a cost of inaction, which is why we act. Have acted, are acting, will act. It's why we've ensured we met the target. You know, you can go back to the 2013 election, and we were all told then that Australia would never meet its 2020 targets if we abolished Labor's carbon tax. Well, we abolished Labor's carbon tax, and we're on track to meet and exceed those 2020 targets. We put in place clear targets for 2030, but they're different from the Labor Party. You know, this morning I heard Tanya Plibersek being interviewed lying about Warwick McGibbon's modelling. She claims that he has backed up his previous modelling and said that there is no difference in the economic cost between the two parties' positions. That's not true. He's indicated there's a $60 billion difference between the economic impact of our approach versus the economic impact of Labor's target. And yet the Labor Party is telling bald-faced lies about that.
Shorten has flagged price controls on childcare as well. Will you?
We will always take a close look there, but the evidence of what we've done to date, as the Prime Minister referenced last night, is that the Bureau of Stats data shows 9% reduction in terms of out-of-pocket costs on average for Australian households. Those benefits felt in a greater way by low and middle income households, many of whom are thousands of dollars better off under our changes. But just yesterday, you saw another instance of our compliance action in the childcare sector as well. Multiple arrests as a result of multiple raids, clamping down on those who seek to rip off the system. This is something the Labor Party never did because, again, they're never careful with taxpayers' money. They're reckless with taxpayers' money.
Does it have implications in terms of, the payroll tax component for childcare providers if you do have this increase in their wages?
Well, absolutely. Modelling shows that there's a $591 million bill that will come to childcare providers under Labor's policy for payroll tax, that many small providers will be pushed into having to pay payroll tax for the first time. This is just another one of the unforeseen consequences of Labor's policy, because they don't think about the consequences, they don't think through the detail, they don't release any detail. They've just let the United Voice Union cook up a policy to back in one of their biggest donor groups in the United Voice Union. They haven't thought about how it would be delivered. Smaller childcare providers will face significant extra costs. You've got even the biggest childcare provider in the country today, Good Start, out there saying they assume that the Labor Party in government would pick up the tab of the extra superannuation costs under this policy, but nobody really knows, and Bill Shorten won't say. So
you're saying that childcare providers, childcare workers, shouldn't be paid more because their employers will have to pay more tax?
Laura, what I'm saying is that there are consequences to Labor's policies. Now, we back the process of the Independent Fair Work Commission to make annual wage determinations. We encourage childcare providers where they can to pay above award conditions. Last year, the award rates rose by around 3.5%. That was above average wage increases, so you do see growth that occurs there. But what we don't think you should have is a Labor Party policy that doesn't actually consider the consequences of, if childcare providers are paying more tax, then they're going to have to put their fees up. If you put in a price cap, as you suggested before, and they can't put their fees up, then they're going to go out of business or they're going to sack staff and there'll be fewer jobs.
Where's the discrepancy here? Because we all know, those that have put kids through childcare in recent years, that it's extremely expensive, yet the workers get paid a pittance. Where does the money go? Because, I mean, if the best private schools in the country can run their organisations for a similar amount, how do the childcare centres... I mean, they're not serving the kids caviar for afternoon tea. Where does all the money go?
Well, the childcare sector does have a for-profit element as well as a not-for-profit element, and estimates are that profits were around $1.3 billion last year. It's another question as to why it is that you would step into that field and have massive government subsidies to pay those employees in what is a fairly profitable sector already.
OK, but what would you do, Simon Birmingham? You know this sector pretty well. How do you make sure the wages of childcare workers go up and there is not this extra burden on employers in terms of payroll tax? What's the solution?
Well, as I flagged, last year we saw the award increase in terms of childcare workers rise higher than average wages.
Is that enough?
That's something... Oh, it's a start, and it's about making sure you continue to do so. I've also been very public in my position that I think some of those highly profitable centres ought to make sure they follow the lead of others, such as Good Start, and pay above award wages. If you're making good profits, the employees ought to share in that. The taxpayer shouldn't have to come in, as Bill Shorten proposes, and prop that up. I mean, the Labor Party has come along in this election campaign and said they've got a radical new policy where they don't really know how it's going to work. They can't actually say how these wage subsidies will be paid. They won't say whether superannuation is covered. They won't say whether payroll tax is covered. There's little detail in terms of any of that. They won't rule out the possibility that it ends up running through the trade union movement like it did last time, which was heavily criticised by the Auditor-General.
Yesterday we saw Bill Shorten give an emotional response to a story in the Daily Telegraph. It was certainly seen within Labor ranks as the peeling away the layers and showing who Shorten is. That authenticity could well be received quite well within the electorate, given that's been one of his problems, is proving his authenticity in terms of opinion polls. His popularity's been low. That could be a turning point in this campaign.
Look, I've got no doubt that Bill Shorten is proud of his mum and grateful for all that she sacrificed for his upbringing, just as Scott Morrison has spoken about his dad, who was a police officer, and the values that that's instilled in him. In the end, I think Scott was very strong yesterday in his response, that he thought that type of reflection and digging into family members' history or past has no real place. And our message to the Australian people is choose who you vote for, based on the vast policy differences at this election, based on the choice between higher taxes or lower taxes, more jobs, fewer jobs, stronger economy, weaker jobs, not these sorts of sideshows or distractions that have no place in terms of sensible, thoughtful commentary.
Now, Morrison said last night he'll lead from the middle. Is he viewed in your party as a moderate or a Conservative? And I ask this question because it's important, because the Conservatives thought that Turnbull was too moderate, and that was really one of the arguments for getting rid of him.
Look, Laura, I think Scott is truly a centrist in terms of Liberal Party thinking.
Is that a new faction?
Has always worked. No, I mean, Scott is somebody who was a state director at the party level, outside of his work in the private sector, in the tourism industry and elsewhere. And in that state director's role, he had to make sure that he managed the integrity of party operations and worked across all party members regardless of their views or ideology. And I think in his entire time in the federal parliament since 2007, he's brought that same approach. He's worked with everybody, worked with anybody on a basis where he engages with them fairly, even-handedly, and in a trusting relationship, and that is reciprocated to him.